Did you know that Robert F. Kennedy had a a brain worm? Well, apparently, this U.S. presidential hopeful had a brain scan in 2010 after reporting memory loss and a general mental fog to his healthcare provider. The scan found an encysted worm in his brain, and by encysted I mean the worm was in a cyst. It was in a capsule of sorts. According to Kennedy, the worm was dead. And I'm sure I could make a joke about it starving to death in a politician's brain, but I won't. I'll be nice. He went on to state that he could beat Trump and Biden in a debate, even if he had 5 of these critters. He had a pork tapeworm larva, not the earthworm hilariously shown here. So what was this worm, and how did it get there? You might be surprised by the answer. Hint, he did not get it from eating meat. And you may also be surprised by how common this serious condition is. Let's start by taking a look at this worm's life cycle. We'll start with the adult. But remember, this is not what Kennedy had in his noodle. Kennedy had a larval tapeworm. We'll get to that. The adult seen here lives in the intestine and it absorbs nourishment that you have thoughtfully pre-digested for it. At one end is something called a scolex. This is the head end of the animal, but it really isn't a head. There are no eyes, mouth, or brain. There are suction cups and hooks instead that allow it to attach to the inside of the intestine. A tapeworm contains no digestive system, no circulatory system, no nervous system. Really, there's not much there. The animal is geared towards making babies. It absorbs food along its paper-thin body, and the body is made up of segments called proglottids. These segments are geared entirely towards reproduction. The proglottids fill up with fertilized eggs, and then these segments are shed in the animal's poop. And now for a close-up. You can see the proglottids under a microscope on the left. Tapeworms are hermaphrodites, and each of these segments has its own vagina, ovary, uterus, and testes, and these segments are repeated over and over and over again. Adult worms have sex in the intestine, and each uterus fills up with about 1 million or so eggs. If you're lucky enough to only have one worm, don't worry, these guys will happily have sex with themselves. Proglottids, now full of eggs, are then shed in your feces. By the way, if you happen to see little bits of what appears to be incredibly thin linguine in your stool, you might want to have that looked at. The fertilized or embryonated eggs that are shed in the feces might be ingested by another mammal. If they are, a cute little baby larval worm pops out of the egg once it reaches the intestine of the new host. But it doesn't stay there. It burrows through the lining of the intestine until it finds a blood vessel. Then it hitches a ride in the blood until it finds a nice quiet place to settle down. Usually this is in muscle tissue, but it can occur elsewhere. The larva walls itself off to protect itself from your immune system. It builds a tiny little capsule, known as a cyst, as we've already discussed. Fluid seeps into the cyst, and this is what the worm feeds on. On the left here, you can see several cysts in a piece of muscle, meat, from a pig. Well, on the right, you can see cysts that formed on the surface of a heart. Each cyst contains a single larva and is about the size of a grain of rice. Larval tapeworms cause damage. As the larva grows, the capsule, the cyst, grows and tissue is destroyed. Muscle tissue is quite good at repairing itself, and if you only have a few of these little worms, you'll probably be just fine. These guys here probably weren't. So what you're seeing here is an x-ray at the top of the pelvis, and you can see there's lots and lots of cysts within the abdominal muscles and pelvic muscles, and below that you're seeing lots and lots of cysts within the muscles of the leg. Cysts can form in other places. They can form in tissues that are far more vulnerable. And if you're squeamish, maybe look away, because cysts can form on the surface of the eye. They can form directly on the sclera, the white of the eye, or as you're seeing here, they can form within the conjunctiva, which is the pink lining of the eyelids. This isn't the worst case scenario though. They can form inside the eye as well. You can have a cyst floating around within the vitreous humor. That is the liquid between your lens and retina. And as they float around, you apparently will see this as a blurry little blob moving through your field of view. I hope we can all agree, though, that the worst place to get a worm would be in the brain. The formation of a larval cyst anywhere in the body is a condition known as cysticercosis. But if the larva forms within the central nervous system specifically, so within the brain or spinal cord, then it's referred to as neurocysticercosis. And this is what Kennedy had. And this is a serious condition. So as the larva grows and as the cyst expands, it destroys neurons. Those are the cells that conduct electrical signals in the brain. So it can change your personality. It can make you appear that you're having a mental issue rather than a parasite issue. It can lead to loss of balance, headaches, confusion, memory loss, seizures, and even death. Okay then, but I still haven't talked much about how you actually get this organism in your body. There are two stages in the worm's life cycle, as we've discussed, an immature larval form and a mature adult. And remember, only the adult is capable of reproduction. Think of caterpillars. A caterpillar is the larva of a butterfly. The caterpillar is just concerned about eating and growing, and the butterfly is mainly concerned about sex. It's the same idea, except the adults, in the case of the worms, are not quite so pretty. If you have an adult tapeworm in your intestines, you are said to be a definitive host. If you have the larva, you are said to be an intermediate host. Now, tapeworms are generally quite picky about the species they infect, but interestingly, humans and pigs are both capable of being intermediate or definitive hosts, or even both at the same time, for this particular worm. That's not unusual. There are several diseases and parasites that can be exchanged between pigs and humans, not because pigs are filthy, as we're commonly led to believe, but because pigs and humans, for better or worse, are very similar. Now let's take a closer look at that life cycle. My apologies for the ramble. Our pig at the bottom has eaten some veggies or grass contaminated with pork tapeworm eggs that were shed from a definitive host. This pig will become an intermediate host and develop encysted larvae in its flesh. If a person eats the flesh of this pig without cooking it sufficiently, the larva will make its way to the intestines, develop into an adult, and attach itself to the inner wall of the intestine. The human has now become a definitive host and will be shedding eggs in their feces. Note that in many parts of the world, improperly treated human waste is used to fertilize crops. Veggies that are contaminated with soil containing eggs may infect anyone that does not sufficiently cook or clean this produce. But in this case, because the person is consuming the eggs and not the larva, they will become an intermediate host and will have larvae embedded throughout their bodies, possibly even in their brain. But there's another twist. Pigs can also be definitive hosts. Pigs will eat just about anything, like us, including their brethren, hopefully not like us. And although the practice is frowned upon and illegal in many places, farmers have been known to feed pigs scraps of uncooked pork. If the pork contains larvae, the pig will become a definitive host and will shed eggs in its feces. This completes the cycle. As you can see, a poorly run pig farm could create a population of pigs and farmers that keep reinfecting themselves with larvae and adults. So what have we learned? Larvae can only be acquired by ingesting eggs, and adult tapeworms can only be acquired by ingesting larvae in meat. Kennedy's brainworm did not come from eating meat, as has often been reported in the media, but rather came from eating produce grown in contaminated soil. If anyone ever holds a gun to your head, for some reason, and offers you a choice between veggies contaminated with eggs or meat contaminated with larvae, take the meat. The adult is the least damaging stage. And again, it really shouldn't be especially surprising that larval tapeworms are very problematic if they take up residence in your head. There's a CT scan here on the left, and notice those large holes. Those are cysts. A lot of nervous tissue has been destroyed here, and unfortunately, neurons are not very good at repairing themselves or replacing themselves, so this is permanent damage. This is a condition that affects over 50 million people worldwide, and millions of people die every year. You can see here the countries that are especially affected. Now, before we leave, I did mention that Kennedy's worm was dead when they discovered it. Why might that be? Well, it didn't starve. This worm needs to move on to the next stage in order to continue development. So the larva only lives for a certain period of time, and then the larva needs to be consumed. With tapeworms, we generally have an intermediate host that's a herbivore, and then we have a definitive host that's a carnivore or omnivore. And this worm died because, well, Kennedy's brain didn't get eaten. And finally, would Kennedy be able to outwit Trump and Biden with 5 larval tapeworms under the hood? Maybe. I don't know. I'll let you decide. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. If you'd like to know more about parasites, I've got a video on that. If you have an interest in microbiology, anatomy, physiology, or just enjoy gruesome yet educational dissections, why not swing by my channel? Cheers.